So, thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for showing up. I always have a fear that I'm going to be talking to empty chairs. And so we are right around the corner from the election, and it's time to grapple once again with our gerrymandered districts and see what happens this time. This has unfortunately become a feature of our elections, and it affects both state level races and federal races. And as we enter, or we're about to enter 2019, there is still redistricting related litigation going on in 13 states. And this is as we're just 2 years short of getting new census data and going back to the drawing board and having new districts drawn. This decade we've faced an onslaught of maps that are extremely gerrymandered on partisan lines, maps that are racially gerrymandered, and other maps that are generally unfair. And so that raises some questions. What's going on? Why does this keep happening? And what can we do to fix it? These are all good questions, and we'll dig into some of that this evening. There is a solution that's gaining momentum, a policy solution, and that's independent redistricting commissions. My colleagues and I have been studying and advising on commissions and how to structure a good redistricting process for the last several years, and we're confident that if a commission is well designed, they can do a lot to get us out of the mess that we seem to be in right now. But commissions aren't the end-all be-all, and our goal is to get fair maps no matter what the process is, no matter who draws the maps. And so there are various routes that can take. But I don't want you just to take my word for it, because that would make for a very short talk. And we will dig into some of these things. So, pardon me while I pull out the keyboard to advance the slides. So, what I want to talk about tonight is, first, I just want to headline the problems that we're trying to stop, like extreme partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering. So that's the first thing. Got to frame the problem in order to understand how you can solve it. The second thing that I want to talk about is why reform is so critical right now. Why policy solutions, why going to state legislatures or in states where citizen initiatives are possible, why that is such a critical thing, and why that window is very small. Well, the window is small because the new districts will be drawn in 2021, so there aren't very many legislative sessions or elections between now and then where changes can be made. And then third, I want to talk about some of the values and some of the key features that we look for when we evaluate redistricting proposals, when we advise on redistricting proposals. This is what I call best designs. And then I ultimately want to open up and leave ample time for questions to make sure that I make myself available to address any concerns that any of you folks have. So, before I get into this, the first problem, which is extreme partisan gerrymandering, the Brennan Center operates in a number of different ways. For those who aren't familiar with our work, we are a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank. We work on reforming and improving our systems of democracy, and we do this through policy reform, through litigation, and through communications work, which includes getting out into communities and making sure that people are better informed on the issues that we work on. I work specifically on redistricting, on the redistricting team, and this involves both advocating for the census and making sure that our census is as accurate as possible, because that is the underlying data that gets used when districts are drawn, and during the redistricting process itself. So that's a little bit about the Brennan Center and what my role is within the Brennan Center. And so with that, I want to dig into the issues. So in any conversation about partisan gerrymandering, it's really important to clearly define the problem. And this is because the term partisan gerrymandering has become kind of a catch-all for everything we don't like about our maps, our redistricting process, our legislatures, and our legislators. It's become somewhat of a go-to for people that just don't like the way politics are playing out in the current environment. And people often say things like funny shapes, incumbents, incumbent protection, dysfunction, etc., etc. And none of these things actually capture what extreme partisan gerrymandering is. It's a very particular problem. And it's one where one party uses the redistricting process to lock in a majority or even a supermajority for an entire decade. It's a tactic for entrenching one party in power regardless of how voters actually vote. And notice all of this has to do with how the way the districts are drawn, or the district map, favors one party over another when everyone's votes are converted into seats in elections. It's not about the shapes of the districts. It's about what the districts produce, what outcomes are possible given the way the districts are drawn. And so, to make this a little bit more concrete, perhaps one of the most egregious examples of an extreme partisan gerrymander from this decade is in North Carolina. And I think that's the legislative building in North Carolina. And North Carolina is going to be in the news a lot over the next 9 months. There's a case that's challenging the way the districts were drawn in that state, and it's on its way to the Supreme Court. And to the extent that the Supreme Court may be willing to step in and say that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unconstitutional, this will be the vehicle for it. And so what happened in North Carolina? Well, in 2008, former President Barack Obama won North Carolina by a very substantial margin. And this raised the alarm for North Carolina Republicans who saw their time in control over state politics numbered. It was a very potent coalition that Barack Obama put together. And so when 2010 hit, and 2010, of course, was a very good year for Republicans all across the country. It was the Tea Party wave election. Republicans in North Carolina were put in a position where they controlled the governorship and both houses of the state legislature. And so, thinking back to just 2 years before, they wanted to find a way to insulate themselves, even if there were, Obama was going to be running for re-election in 2012, but for future candidates, Democratic candidates that could put together similar coalitions that could motivate voters to turn out in similar ways. And so what they did is they broke the state down into very fine geographic units that were coded by how partisan each geographic unit is. And these are very, very small. These are just neighborhoods. And from that, they developed districts that they were fairly certain would perform in a certain way. And that's exactly what has happened. And their explicit goal was to draw a map, a congressional map, that would produce 10 Republicans and 3 Democrats. And that is exactly what has happened throughout the decade. We'll see what happens in this election. But so far, that's exactly how the map has performed. And this was explicitly stated. There were legislators who got on the floor of the state assembly and said, this is our goal. Our goal is to create a 10-3 map. Partisan gerrymandering is not unlawful. The Supreme Court has not stepped in and said we can't do this, and so we're doing it. And again, they were successful. And extreme gerrymanders, like North Carolina's, they didn't happen everywhere, and they don't happen everywhere. On the congressional level, it's impacted about 6 states. And though Pennsylvania has highlighted, the state Supreme Court there did step in and rule that an extreme partisan gerrymander was against the state constitution rather than the federal constitution. But Michigan, Ohio, and North Carolina are the enduring extreme partisan gerrymanders. Texas is a little bit more complicated because it's both partisan and racial. Virginia was a racial gerrymander. And so these are the states where the congressional maps were impacted. It also impacts state legislative districts. And so these are the states where the state legislative districts show a high degree of partisan bias. And where extreme gerrymanders occur, they have crippling effects. Inside state houses, politicians are at each other's throats to control the redistricting process. And all of that rancor, it spills over into the normal legislative business, and everything becomes a really bitter fight. It's immense majorities that voters can't vote out, making them entirely unaccountable. It makes it very easy for business interests and other powerful interests to come in and have a lot of influence because there is very little accountability, ultimately. And when map makers intentionally use political data like they did in North Carolina to create these kinds of maps, we believe at the Brennan Center that they violate the First and the 14th Amendment. We'll see if the 9 Supreme Court justices, or a subset of the 9 Supreme Court justices, agree with us. But if you use a little bit of statistical analysis, you can actually see the harms very clearly. So this is a chart, and I'll walk you through it. So on the bottom axis there, you have the partisan split. And it starts 0% Democratic, 100% Republican, and it goes to 100% Democratic and 0% Republican. And what that split represents is the statewide vote share that each party receives. What the dots on the map represent is at what point does a district go Democratic? At what statewide vote share does each district go? And so what you notice is you have 3 districts that are clustered between 20% and 30% Democratic support statewide. And what that means, if Democrats are only winning 20% of the vote statewide, it means almost every single Democrat in the state is located in those 3 districts. And then what you notice is there's a large gap before you get to your 4th dollar, which again represents a district. There's a split of, so between 30% and just beyond 50%, there are no districts that a Democratic candidate would be expected to win. So in other words, you can cover, Democrats can improve their electoral performance by 25% statewide. They can convince a quarter of all North Carolina voters to vote for them, and they will still not pick up a 4th district. And what you notice is from that 50-50 mark, or just outside the 50-50 mark, and going very steeply up, you get a whole bunch of districts. And that is the firewall. Those are Republican voters being distributed in a very strategic way to produce consistent, narrow victories. One of the things that you notice is you don't have equally Republican districts as you have Democratic districts. You don't have districts that the Democrats need 80% of the statewide vote to win. What you do have is districts that are between 50% and really 65%. And this was very carefully calculated, because where do elections happen in North Carolina? North Carolina is a very prototypical swing state. The two black lines represent the range of statewide vote shares that Democrats have been able to win in North Carolina, with the bolded black line on the left there being their worst performance at about 45% of the statewide vote, and the bolded black line on the right side representing 2008 being their absolute best performance over the last 10 plus years. And so that gap is what we call a lack of responsiveness. And what we look for when we're analyzing the way districts are drawn is a responsive plan, which means there is a consistent rate of change. That is, one party improves the way it performs statewide, it steadily gains electoral victories. It steadily gains districts. And as a juxtaposition, I'll show you California's map. And so the light blue dots are the map that California used in the decade between 2000 and 2010. The dark blue dots are the districts that California's Independent Redistricting Commission drew for this decade. And one of the things that you'll notice is it's not a perfectly straight line, and there are legitimate reasons why districts wouldn't perfectly align in a responsive straight line, but there is a general trend. Both parties, if they improve their electoral performance, are expected to gain seats. And that's something actually that you can observe if you go and you look at what districts are in play for this election, which is supposed to be an unprecedented Democratic wave, and how many of those seats are in states where the maps have been drawn fairly, versus how many of the districts that are in play are in traditional swing states like Michigan, like North Carolina, like Ohio, where there are extreme partisan gerrymanders. And so this is the issue, one of the issues that we're working to overcome. The second problem, as I mentioned, is racial gerrymandering. And this is a problem that has affected some key states throughout the country, that involves taking minority voters and either packing them into as few districts as possible and concentrating as many black or Latino voters in those districts, or cracking them, which means, again, spreading them out across a lot of different districts so they can never meaningfully impact the outcome of the elections. And this has been a running problem in states like, again, North Carolina. So the first map that North Carolina drew was actually, and I'll go back to the chart, so the light blue map was the racial gerrymander. And the racial gerrymander was struck down by the United States Supreme Court because there is well-established law on that being something that is impermissible. But when the North Carolina legislature came back to the table to cure the unlawful racial gerrymander. They drew the partisan, and the partisan gerrymander is the dark blue line. And one of the things that you may notice is there's not a whole lot of difference between the racial gerrymander and the partisan gerrymander. And that's because in some states, in the South in particular, there is such a close relationship between race and party affiliation that the two can be so closely correlated that you can do a partisan gerrymander and essentially completely nullify the political power of communities of color. Other states that have been affected by the racial gerrymandering issue are Alabama, Georgia, and Virginia. And looking at Virginia, again, the light blue was the racial gerrymander that the Virginia Assembly drew. And what you notice is it's got that similar shape to both the original and the current North Carolina maps, where you have a few districts well to the left of where elections occur, and then you have a very sharp line of districts just outside of the range of where elections occur. When the court ruled that this was an impermissible gerrymander, the court in this case didn't send it back to Virginia's legislature. Instead, the court brought in an expert to redraw the map. And the dark blue represents Virginia's map that is currently in place. And undoing the racial gerrymander produced a map that is fairly responsive. Again, the districts are spaced fairly evenly, and as one party gains vote share statewide, it's expected to win additional districts. The third problem that I want to talk about is the process itself. So both with extreme partisan gerrymandering and racial gerrymandering, the things that I've discussed was about outcome. Is the outcome fair? Are the election outcomes that the map allows fair? But there's another way to think about redistricting, which is procedural fairness. Is the way the map comes to be drawn fair? Are the rules fair? Can one party just steamroll the other if they have the necessary votes in the legislative chambers, and if the governor has a veto as the governor of that same party and willing to sign off on an extreme partisan gerrymander? And the way that the process has been used in the past decade, there are some features that have allowed the extreme partisan gerrymanders to take hold. The first is the extreme secrecy. The maps that were produced in Ohio, in Michigan, in North Carolina, were in the first instance drawn behind closed doors. Outside consultants, usually who were very closely affiliated with the national party, were in the room, and the product is usually the map is one mastermind who's being bankrolled by either the state party or the national party to produce a map that essentially guarantees a certain advantage, regardless of which way the electoral winds are shifting. And so this brings us to the importance of reform. And I've mentioned the courts somewhat, and we've even seen and talked about Virginia, where the court stepped in and ordered the map to be redrawn. But the courts are one of the main issues. The U.S. Supreme Court in particular has still though it's had several opportunities, not ruled that extreme partisan gerrymandering is unlawful. And in the absence of that red light, the parties, and I do want to be clear that the Democrats just didn't have an opportunity to gerrymander because the 2010 election brought Republicans into power. The parties essentially view it as agreement. So without the courts putting the kibosh on such extreme gerrymandering, the parties say, well, until that happens, we should do whatever we can to enhance our own power. And the second problem is that it's hard for the court to fix everything, even if it were to step in. Some of the biggest issues, because all the court can do is just draw the boundary and say this is in bounds and this is out of bounds. The court still cannot force a state legislature to use fair rules, to allow public input, to make sure that one party can't, on a party line vote, steamroll the other. It can just say that if you cross a certain threshold, this is unlawful. And so that is where reform comes in. Reform is not just about saying what has happened here is unlawful, it's about projecting a positive vision of how redistricting should work. And the way we think about reform is in terms of values. Though I've talked about independent redistricting commissions, there are other ways of getting at a fair process. And what that means, and the reason why I talk about values, and maybe I should take a quick step back and talk about how we do our policy work. So we're a national organization. We're based in New York City, but we work on redistricting proposals all around the country. And we work with members of Congress and national groups as well. And there are some limitations to that. For example, we have no way of fully understanding what the political dynamics are in various states. When I was working with advocates in Ohio, I don't understand and I don't have an intimate knowledge of Ohio politics. And so we depend on state level groups and state level partners to come to us and inform us about what's possible. They lay out what the reality of the situation on the ground is, because that political reality we do ultimately, though we have our ideal of what we'd like to see happen, we know that that's not always possible, and we don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. And what we do is we work with our state level partners to figure out where are the points of, where are the sticking points, what are the absolute deal breakers, and where are there opportunities to improve things. And then we lay out a menu of options because there are competing values at play in redistricting, and these are them. So the first thing that we look for is independence from politics. And this is why the Independent Redistricting Commission is such a good model. An independent commission should serve essentially like a jury. These should be people who are not party officials, who are not elected officials, who aren't closely affiliated or associated with elected officials or party officials. These should be people who aren't lobbyists. These are folks who are impartial. And that type of independence increases the likelihood that more legitimate redistricting criteria would be used, not outcomes for one party over the other, but capturing communities that share some sort of interest that should be represented either on the state or national level. The second is clear rules. regardless of whether you have an independent commission or a legislature, there should be very clear criteria that the map drawer is applying to the data. The third thing is race equity, and the real importance of race equity is that both parties can often use communities of color for political ends. And the other important reason why states should start enacting their own protections for communities of color is because we've seen the federal government retreat from being the voting rights watchdog that it has traditionally been over the course of the last 50 years. And so it is important that these traditionally disenfranchised communities do have clear protections. The fourth thing is there should be rules that encourage compromise. And what that means is one party shouldn't be able to act unilaterally. There should be some requirement that members of the other party are required for passage. And then fifth, there should be transparency and public participation. And this is, again, incredibly important to make sure that things are done above board, because one of the issues is that there's simply just not that much trust because of the way things have traditionally been done behind closed doors. And so if it's above board, if people can look at the data that's being used, if people can analyze maps before they're voted on and show up and comment on them, maybe submit alternative proposals, there's just a lot more buy-in from the public. And so ultimately, there is opportunity. So if you don't have independence, and there are a lot of places, and again, some of these places are states that you would consider progressive. Massachusetts, for example, there is no interest in Massachusetts in adopting an independent redistricting commission. But there may be an opportunity for reform, and so if independence isn't an option, if the legislators insist on continuing to have control over the process, it means you can ratchet up the other parts. You can make the rules far more strict to make sure that the boundaries are very clearly delineated and the legislators can't go beyond them. You can require much more extreme transparency and public input to make sure that if the legislators are acting in ways that is just protecting their incumbency or ensuring that the party that they're members of just get to win election after election regardless of what the voters want, that the public can see that. And so this trade-off, this balance, is ultimately what we're looking at when we advise our state-level partners, when we talk to legislators, when we talk to other partners in the work. And in terms of the redistricting rules, which are critical, the first thing about imposing redistricting rules is they should be ranked. There is an order of priority to the rules. And if there isn't, one of the things that can happen is it gives the map drawer an opportunity to hide behind something. They say, oh, you know, this map doesn't have maybe the best partisan fairness because we were trying to draw very compact districts. And that's what we were trying to do. We weren't trying to do anything bad. We were just, there's this other criteria that we're trying to put into place. And so it's very important to make it clear what the order of the rules are. And so the first is complying with federal law. And really, this isn't much of a choice. Federal law supersedes state law. And so things like equal districts in terms of population, that's imposed by the federal constitution. But that is a rule that gets applied first. The Federal Voting Rights Act, whatever is left of it, that's also a federal rule that has to be applied first. The second thing that should be applied is state race equity criteria. And like I said, we don't know what will happen to the Federal Voting Rights Act given the current composition of the Supreme Court. And so it's important for states to pass their own protections. The third criteria is communities of interest. And many people believe that communities of interest is a vague term, and in some ways it is. It's a flexible term, and it's designed to be flexible. And this is really the thing that we believe should drive the redistricting process, is districts should capture communities of interest. And what a community of interest is a group of people that share some sort of identity that's not partisanship, that represents a certain set of interests. And it could be based on an industry. If there is a dominant industry in a certain part of the state where there's a large employer, and it could be manufacturing, it could be something, it could be farming, it could be something totally different, and that could unify a community. And one of the ways that communities of interest can be actualized is by asking people to draw lines around their own communities. If you go and you ask, what is your community? Here's a map of New Jersey. Can you draw your community as you understand it? And if enough people do that over and over again, and you aggregate that, you can get heat maps. And those heat maps can serve as the kind of the nuclei, the anchor points around which districts can be structured. And so that community of interest model, and this is the way the California redistricting process worked, can produce really good maps. And then the last is the geographic constraints. And those are things like not wanting districts to split up cities and townships, wanting to maintain compactness, and those sorts of things. For redistricting commissions, independent redistricting commissions, these are the additional values that you would add to the rules. So one, the commissioners should be selected using an independent selection process, so not the politicians picking folks that are going to be their champions, but truly some independent agency, a third party, screening and then selecting members. And again, clear prioritized criteria for who can serve, who is eligible, who is ineligible. A size of about 9 to 15 members, so large enough to be able to reflect the geographic diversity of a state, the racial and ethnic diversity of a state, and to get gender diversity and political diversity on the commission without making it so big that it can't function nimbly. Promote negotiation and compromise, and again, this is imposing supermajority requirements for passage of a map to make sure that independents, Republicans, and Democrats all have to give a thumbs up before something is put into place. Transparency, again, incredibly, incredibly important to disclose both what kind of data is being considered, what kind of information is going into the plan, and also what is the thought process. Why are certain choices being made? Adequate funding, because, and this is really the critical thing, because the issue of getting just citizens together to draw the maps is they need technical support. That means they will need to hire people who can crunch the numbers and do the mapping, and also attorneys who can advise on the voting rights implications and other various protections that exist, and then sufficient time to do the work. And So this is what I'll finish with before opening up to questions. 2018 has been a fairly incredible year for reform. So far, Ohio passed reform that will change the way the congressional districts are drawn. This is incredibly good news because, as I mentioned before, Ohio has a congressional map that is an extreme partisan gerrymander. And Ohio's proposal is not an independent redistricting commission. Instead, they are strict criteria, so they went with the rules route, and requiring compromise. So there is a supermajority requirement within the legislature for a map to be passed. And next Tuesday, the voters of 4 states, Michigan, Missouri, Colorado, and Utah, will be voting on various proposals to change the way redistricting happens in those jurisdictions. In Michigan, it will be a fully independent commission. In Missouri, which already uses a commission model for redistricting, but this will involve creating a new position called the nonpartisan state demographer, who will do the map drawing, and that nonpartisan state demographer will be constrained by a new set of rules. Colorado, also an independent commission, and then in Utah, an advisory commission. An advisory commission is like an independent commission, except they don't have the full authority to enact a map. The advisory commission will draw a map, but then it sends it over to the legislature, and the legislature still has to vote on it. But if the legislature votes no, they have to explain why, and if the legislature imposes its own plan, the legislature has to explain why its plan accomplishes the stated goals and meets the criteria better than what the advisory commission did. So again, it's not exactly what we would push for in the first instance, but it's got enough of those values, of those elements for good redistricting that we look for. And with that, that brings me to the questions. I'd be happy to touch on anything that I've discussed here or any other questions about the litigation or anything else redistricting related.
Could you say something about other types of voting arrangements like proportional representation? You mentioned communities of interest, and one way to get that would be through letting people vote on, rank a whole bunch of candidates, one through the end, and allocate votes that way.
So the question was, just to repeat it in case folks in the back didn't hear, was about ranked choice voting and other alternative forms of voting as a way to achieve the type of responsive representation. Ranked choice voting can work, but even within ranked choice voting, unless we are abolishing districts altogether, and the New Jersey legislature is elected by everyone in the state, there will still be lines that are drawn, and that will still impact, even within a different electoral system, what candidates are viable and what is possible. I have studied ranked choice voting somewhat, and what I will say is it can produce good results, but it's just a different system, and it can be gamed in different ways. And I don't want to, it's a whole conversation. We can spend the next while talking about it, and what I will say is it's often presented as the silver bullet, this cure-all for the things the ills that we are currently facing. And it has nice features and things that I believe in, but if we're worried about polarization and other things, I don't necessarily think that it is something that does away with everything. And certainly if our elections are continue to be funded in the way that they are, that still remains an issue. And so it's something that I'm glad that different jurisdictions are exploring. We are looking, Maine now has a ranked choice voting system. We will be tracking that and seeing what happens. There are various cities around the country, Minneapolis, San Francisco, Santa Fe, Portland, Cambridge, Massachusetts, that use ranked choice voting. And these are recent developments, and so we are looking to see what the impacts are in those jurisdictions before getting out there and endorsing it as reform for pursuing. Yes?
How do you find impartial people also engaged in the political system?
So the question is how do you find impartial people for the independent commission, I assume? The question isn't impartiality. It's, and one of the responses that we receive from legislators is you can't take politics out of redistricting. And that's not what an independent commission seeks to do. It's not about taking politics out of something that is inherently political. It's about getting people in a room that don't have a personal vested interest in the outcome. It's people who personally don't benefit from the way certain decisions are made. Exactly, and that's why when you structure rules for selection of commissioners, you're looking at things like people who are involved with or related to party officials, elected officials, lobbyists, and other folks who may have, who may gain some sort of favoritism with the elected officials ultimately. A lot of proposals also try to impose rules that prevent folks that serve on an independent commission from running as candidates. So even folks who are thinking, I'll get on this commission, I'll draw a really great district that I can win, and then, a year later or 2 years later I'll run. These are the types of things that commission, the rules around the selection of commissioners need to contemplate. And what we encourage places that are considering commissions to do is not just have these black and white rules, but also have a qualitative aspect to it. And ask people when they're submitting an application to also speak to their ability to apply the rules fairly. And just like in jury selection, attorneys from both sides get to ask questions and see who is going to be able to be fair in the jury process. It's somewhat analogous. Yes?
Why do you think the Supreme Court or lower courts now have a better chance of ruling that extreme partisan redistricting is unlawful?
So the question is why do I think there's a better chance to get a ruling out of our judiciary making extreme partisan gerrymandering unconstitutional? That's a tough question because I don't think our current Supreme Court is particularly comfortable making such a ruling. And in some ways it's understandable. The court traditionally tries to stay away from policy decisions that are directly related to the political branches. So for example, with foreign policy, the court stays away from foreign policy decisions because those are duties that were given to the president, and the court doesn't feel like it has an institutional role to play in those determinations. But there comes a point where the entire system gets, the question of our democratic institutions and the integrity of them come into play. And the reason why the North Carolina case, and really it is, it's, if this isn't an unconstitutional partisan gerrymander, then nothing is. Because you had legislative leaders go on the floor and say, we are drawing a partisan gerrymander, and it's not unconstitutional. And so if that isn't enough, then it's hard to see what would be enough. It's hard to know, what set of facts could be presented to convince the court that this is something that is unlawful. So,
And the North Carolina redistricting hasn't come before courts?
the Supreme Court has not. Yes, so the cases that from, it was a Democratic gerrymander in Maryland and a Republican gerrymander from Wisconsin. They went up to the Supreme Court, and an opinion was issued in June. But those were decided on preliminary questions about what litigants had to do in order to get before the court. So the only thing that has been decided so far is that in order to litigate a case, you can't just challenge all the districts statewide unless you have voters that reside in all the districts that are part of the case. And so they didn't get to the substance of the question. And North Carolina will be the first opportunity for the Supreme Court to reach the substance. Yes, there is a question.
How exactly would you argue that gerrymandering is a violation of the First and 14th Amendment?
Well, this could take a while. But essentially, the First Amendment is the right to association. And so a gerrymander prevents people who want to associate with a certain political party to be able to exercise their rights with respect to that party identity. I mean, this is an oversimplification because I don't want to get into a law school lesson here, but that's a very brief take on that. In terms of the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protection Clause forbids treating different groups of people differently on the basis of some sort of identity. And though if it doesn't involve race or gender, the level of scrutiny that the court applies is fairly lax. That's essentially the basis of the 14th Amendment claim is there is a group of people, they are identified with a certain party, and they are disadvantaged, and their votes do not count equally vis-a-vis their counterparts that identify with a different party. And so there has been official action taken by the state that disadvantages them in relation to the members of the other party. Yes?
What do you attribute the fact that 2018 seems to be a year of reform? Why does, 5 states, their measures that are passed on now?
Well, there's, and redistricting is actually, though we are living in increasingly polarized times, redistricting enjoys a great deal of bipartisan support. The measure in Ohio passed by an overwhelming margin, 75 to 25. And I think there's a real sense by people of all political persuasion that our policymakers have gotten a bit untethered from the will of people. And so I think it's part of a larger story of people just being kind of fed up with the way that politics are starting to play out. And this is a really concrete and palpable thing. Part of it is the timing, and part of it is advocates knowing that, you know, this is the deadline. And if it doesn't happen in 2018 or 2019 or 2020, then it's not happening until 2030. Because new districts are going to be drawn, and we don't know whether the courts are going to be a viable avenue to challenge them. So part of it is advocacy groups trying to get changes through before new districts are drawn. Part of it is it's a political environment where folks are, quite frankly, are fed up. And the other thing is redistricting used to be a very obscure, technical, and quite frankly, boring thing. And here we are on a Thursday evening. There's a room full of people, and people are really engaged on this issue. And the number of articles that there are about gerrymandering and redistricting, and just the level of awareness that people have about this issue is pretty remarkable, and it certainly makes me feel good. Yes?
I'm going to play devil's advocate, and if I can just briefly, I am a partisan. I'm an elected public official here in Union County, and I've run for office a number of times. Why the system used in New Jersey is 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and an independent 5th person. Why is that not just as good at forcing compromise as a totally independent body? You've got 2 people on each side who are arguing their side, but you've got somebody in the middle who, if you want your plan to win, so to speak, you've got to be reasonable. If you're way out on the fringe, then the independent 5th person is going to reject your plan. And in fact, that's what happened in the last redistricting legislatively in New Jersey, that the Democratic plan was seen by the independent person as more reasonable, and that was chosen. So
Right.
why isn't that process working?
Well, it certainly doesn't work as poorly as places where one party can steamroll. So that does help, but it does give that independent person a tremendous amount of power. And the entire process hinges on who can convince that person. And so, and that's a lot of responsibility, and so that individual has to have a tremendous amount of integrity, and also can't impose their will on it. And so I'm originally from Washington State, and we have a very similar process. The political leaders in the legislature, both Republicans and Democrats, appoint one person. So you have 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and then there's a 5th neutral person. And what ends up happening in Washington is they divide the turf. They just say, these are the Republican areas, these are the Democratic areas, and then these are the districts that we'll fight over. And that's also a bad thing, because it's not thinking about what are the naturally occurring communities that should be, that politicians from both parties should be fighting over, and fighting over how to meet their specific political needs. And so, though it doesn't result in the extreme partisan gerrymanders, it can still lead to kind of this reverse engineering where the political identity of various regions is considered above all else. Yes?
I just, first of all, more of a statement than a question, perhaps. First of all, gerrymandering, boiled down to its most basic, is cheating. And the reason that these actions are taking so much interest, they had a big round of redistricting court cases for like the late 70s or maybe 1980, compactness, contiguous, compounding. But the cheating that we have today is much more egregious than it's ever been before. And so it's demanding some kind of judicial response. And the last thing is, as far as the 14th Amendment, wasn't that Twittered? Are we still using it?
That's great. Things have gotten a lot more extreme, and one of the reasons, the last U.S. Supreme Court case before this most recent round was in 2004. And there you had 4 justices saying, no way, these cases don't work. You had 4 justices, though they weren't exactly unified, who had different ideas of how a partisan gerrymandering claim would work. And Justice Kennedy, in the middle, saying, you're going to have to come back to me. This doesn't seem right, but I'm not convinced. And so, go back to the kitchen, cook up a different legal theory, and then maybe I'll make up my mind. Kennedy is obviously now retired, so that's difficult. In the meantime, what happened in 2010 is our data analytics have gotten incredibly sophisticated. And it's possible, with great precision, to predict how people will vote. Though gerrymandering has been a feature, well, I wouldn't call it a feature, a flaw of our democracy for quite some time, it was fairly crude because districts were drawn on a paper map with a marker, and now the level of data analysis that can take place looking at things like Twitter data and various other socioeconomic data and funneled into algorithms, you can get a very accurate political profile of people. You can anticipate who will show up when, and again, these are somewhat different political times that we are in right now, but in a more predictable landscape where presidential years have much higher turnout, midterm elections much lower turnout. There are ways to engineer districts that predictably perform for the vast majority of the decade. And so things have gotten so extreme because the court hasn't stepped in, and also because the tools available now to manipulate this process have gotten incredibly sophisticated. Yes, Yvette.
I have a question about the theory or the concept of reducing every district, which is highly competitive. What about, is that even a feasible thing where you actually force the districts to be drawn so that they're very highly competitive in every election?
So the question is about competitive districts, and is it feasible to draw a whole map with as many competitive districts as possible? The response to that is we do not encourage competitiveness as a criteria. And there's a number of reasons, because competitiveness itself is a somewhat vague term. Because a district can be competitive in a number of different ways. It can be competitive at the primary stage, and that's important. It could be competitive at the general election stage, and that can also be important. But the most important type of competition is having a coherent community with both parties competing to best represent that community. And so just, again, the problem with competitiveness is the same problem in some ways as gerrymandering, where you're thinking about what is the outcome that this district will produce. So you're still jumping ahead to how are people going to vote. And that's the same type of logic that's applied in an extreme partisan gerrymandering. Rather than saying, let's step away from politics and let's think about who lives where and what are their interests. And how do we capture people that share certain interests together as much as possible so they get represented. And in purely competitive, if you just apply a really competitive lens to redistricting, one of the things that happens is communities of color really lose out because racially polarized voting is an unfortunate feature of our democracy, and this applies in extremely democratic places and extremely Republican places. And so you have to, districts, for example, that perform for communities of color are often not very competitive at the general election level because it's hard for candidates that represent those communities to make it out of the primary. And so it's just hard to, though competition is valuable, the better way to think about competition is not to have each individual district competitive, but like in the map that I showed you, the California map, making sure that a map is responsive so there are some competitive districts in every election depending on where the electorate is. And that district may change depending on the political environment of the time. And again, in California now, there are districts that have been held by Republicans forever that are competitive right now. And that's the more important thing, is for those political wins to be reflected by what's happening on the state level. Yes?
That's what's happening in New Jersey congressional races next week. We have 4, maybe 5 districts that have been Republican. This district, 7, has been Republican for more than 60 years and is competitive this year, reflecting the change in the view of the electorate. So I would argue that New Jersey, if it flops 4 districts next week from Republican Democratic, is doing exactly what it should be doing.
I think, yes. I mean, New Jersey has a lot of districts that are in play in today's environment. And New Jersey's map is not an extreme partisan gerrymander by any stretch. It didn't make our list. But
We think it is.
well, again, and I'm talking about specifically an extreme partisan gerrymander, which is a very, very specific thing. But it doesn't mean that the process doesn't matter. Again, it's not just about the outcomes, it's not about the results, though that is a way to measure. But just because it doesn't register on some measures, it doesn't mean that there has been the right type of procedural fairness applied, and it doesn't mean that communities have been captured in a fair way. Yes? Yeah.
So since gerrymandering is so extreme, why do you think the courts haven't stepped forward and tried to fix majority power or other reasons?
So the question is why the courts haven't stepped in since things have gotten so extreme. And there was a cynical, somewhat cynical proposed answer, which is that they want to keep a certain party in power. I think it is very complicated for a court to step in. One thing that the court doesn't want to do is create an avalanche of litigation. And so it's hard, and in legal speak, there's something called a limiting principle, which is, the line that demarcates, what's lawful and what's unlawful. And that can be a hard line to draw in this instance. Because the fact of the matter is, in redistricting, someone is always unhappy. Sometimes, everyone's unhappy, but just a little bit. That's good. That's a good redistricting process. If everyone walks away and no one feels like they truly won. And so that can be tough. The other thing about partisan gerrymandering is, in the court's view, party it's not the same thing as, let's say, race. Race is an immutable characteristic. And the discrimination faced by people of color is a result of that. Same thing with gender. Discrimination faced in terms of party affiliation, that's a little harder to pin down because that's a more flexible thing. People can switch party allegiance. And it's just been hard for the court to grapple with these things. And the court has been very resistant, and the courts often are, to the science behind it. And social science has been pretty convinced that actually, party affiliation is not that flexible, and that it can be predicted fairly readily. And this is something that's a big problem. But the courts have just not felt comfortable stepping in because they don't want to open up a flood of litigation every single time anyone draws a redistricting plan where someone feels like their voice doesn't matter. And I mean, that is, I think there is a lot of validity to it. The court doesn't feel like it's in a position to say, oh yeah, there are way too many safe Democratic districts here. This isn't right. Or there are way too many safe Republican districts here. That's way too right. That the court feels like they are tinkering with the other branches of government. Yeah.
Could you say a little more about what this notion of coherent community or natural community?
Yeah.
You talked about one process of having individuals draw how they see their own community. And I'm trying to think of something on an issue like the gateway tunnel or the terrible New Jersey transit service, which I think has mobilized a lot of people around wanting to change. I'm trying to think if it's a group of people that would be affected by a common issue, or, I'm just struggling with what that means.
It could be things like commuting corridors. We know that there are areas, and I'm sure the folks in this room know better than me where the lines are, what are kind of New York City centric area parts of New Jersey, and kind of the folks that live there feed into that job market. It could be things like socioeconomics. It could be things like types of employment. There could be areas where it could be based around school districts. It can be based around any number of different things. And one of the best ways is to crowdsource it, is to put it to the folks that live in the areas, to identify, what is your community. And that process worked in California, but it was resource and time intensive. And it takes a lot of organizing to get enough people to participate where it's actually meaningful. And if you don't have those resources, and if you don't have that time, it works slightly differently. But there are a lot of data sources, and again, the same data analytics that can be used for nefarious purposes and to identify the partisan preference that different people have, you can also use that to see, how do people in particular areas commute, where do they work, what are the family compositions like in those areas, and you can draw other conclusions based on that come up with some unifying factor that is not just pure partisan affiliation. Yeah.
So you talk about the advent of sophisticated analytics, but how reliable is the data that's being analyzed? I'm thinking especially about the new census that's coming up. And so that's only one bit of data. So how does a commission know how reliable the data is that they're being given to analyze or take into effect, like the number of people in the district, if you do it this way? The census isn't accurate. How do they get accurate?
So this question is about the underlying data in the census and the accuracy of the census, and also just general accuracy of the analytics. The accuracy of the census is a huge concern right now. With the citizenship question on it and just the general distrust of the federal government among certain communities, there is fear that there's going to be a very substantial, it's called a differential undercount, where some groups are undercounted at a much higher rate as others. This is a fairly unprecedented thing, that we are thinking about what will be possible to do in the instance of, a failed census, or at least a deeply flawed census. The fact of the matter is, most states by law tie their redistricting to census data. So, short of changing those laws, that will continue to be the underpinning of it. There are, and I'm not a statistician, but there are ways to understand where the gaps are. And the census itself measures this in terms of where are forms being sent out and where are they not coming back from. And certain conclusions can be drawn, it's called imputation, can be made based on that. And states could take that data and take the census data and tweak it themselves to try to make it more accurate. And this is something that we are thinking about. We're not fully comfortable advocating that states start tinkering with the census data yet, because we think that it can cut both ways. But we are exploring those types of solutions. The second part of the question, the data analytics question, this is an interesting election for that very reason, because some of the underlying assumptions that were in place in, say, 2010, 2011, when the current maps were drawn, are different now. Because the parties have shifted, the parties themselves. And so there are voters who may have, say, voted Republican all along, who may feel like the party has moved beyond where they feel comfortable. And so that those types of things are hard to anticipate, but that is essentially the goal. And so while that can happen, what we've seen up to this point is the extreme partisan gerrymanders have performed exactly like they were designed to perform. Ohio, North Carolina, Michigan, there hasn't been a single seat change over the course of this decade, and they were drawn to produce those results that they have. So it's a pretty remarkable accuracy that the map drawers have. Yes?
Does the Brennan Center work at all with voter suppression?
Yes. So we have, in addition, in the democracy program, which my team is a part of, we have the redistricting team, but we also have a voting rights team that works on things like voter suppression, voter registration, and other related issues. We have a money in politics team, and we have an election security team, and we have a fair courts team. So we are working on democracy issues from a number of different angles. Yes.
Sorry, one more thing. So
Sure.
on a hyper-local level, meaning like town by town, do you even go further than congressional districts, or go deeper and look at how certain towns may be gerrymandering, for to create wards or create whatever within their, do you even look at that? Or is that something, and is that tied to the census as well? The town waits for the census and then decides how it's going to split up its
Yeah, absolutely, and this is a really good question. So it's about whether gerrymandering happens on the local level, and whether we look at those localities. And other than kind of the biggest cities, we don't. And it's a matter of resources. So we do focus primarily on state legislative districts and congressional districts. But your question is really well placed. And having well-informed people who can track the process and show up and advocate is incredibly important. And one of the areas where we're most concerned is in the South. That used to be covered by the Voting Rights Act, by Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, and in those jurisdictions that had a history of racial discrimination, they had to send any sort of voting change or district change to the Department of Justice in order to get pre-cleared before it took effect. That part of the law is no longer in effect because the Supreme Court struck it down in 2013. And so a lot of our peer groups, our civil rights partners, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, the Mexican American Legal Defense Fund, the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, and other folks are really nervous going into this next redistricting cycle, where those protections no longer apply. Because again, we're all dealing with a resource shortage. We don't have enough people to be able to track what's happening at every school board, every town, every county. And the consequences are really significant on those levels as well. The local level is where policing and public safety and garbage pickup and schooling decisions are being made. And so those are areas where community engagement is going to be incredibly important. And I think it is possible for people to be effective advocates just by showing up and by asking questions and making sure that the decisions that are being made also reflect not some sort of political agenda, but the community needs. But we don't have much of a presence on the local level. Yes?
Could you talk more about the concept of natural community versus the ghetto? And what would be helpful long term in terms of fundamental fairness? Is it wrong to be aiming at integration of all neighborhoods? Because I thought you were inclined with something you said that, for example, a racially defined community would have more voter potency to get stuck together in one voting group. Is that what you're saying?
Well, what's important with communities of color is that they have an equal opportunity to elect a candidate of choice. And so there's been a lot of research done and long documented history about the fact that, and again, I've worked on voting rights lawsuits in areas like LA, which are incredibly democratic. But if a district isn't drawn in a way that the Latino or the Black community forms a majority, they're not able to elect a Black or a Latino member to represent that community at the state legislative level or the congressional level. And the reason why that type of descriptive representation, that co-ethnic representation, is incredibly important is there's another body of research that shows that, and it's really pretty remarkable studies that white representatives that receive constituent emails from constituents who have an identifiably Black or Latino name are far less likely to respond to that constituent inquiry. There have also been studies about where does money get spent when the elected officials get money for use in the district, and again, again, there's a lot of kind of co-ethnic solidarity when money is brought back to the district, and this is on the congressional level. If it's a white representative, overwhelmingly, that money gets spent in the white parts of that community. And so there are really significant reasons why it's important, not just because it enriches the perspectives of our elected officials and makes the debate and conversation in the state capitol or in the national capital richer, because there are people with those perspectives there. There are really important on-the-ground consequences for the constituencies as well, and that's one of the reasons why race equity is a pretty high up criteria, because there are real policy ramifications. Well, thank you everyone, it's 9 o'clock.
First of all, we'd just like to thank you for a very informative evening, and thank you, the audience, for coming out. Just two things I just wanted to mention on the way out. I just heard that some people said that it was difficult to see some of the PowerPoint, but that PowerPoint will be up on the NFRPP website in about another week. So you can go there, there'll be a link, and you can see all the information.